Hi, welcome or welcome back. This is Lee, and today I'm going to talk about fastening off or tying off your work. This is another thing that I felt like wasn't always explained in patterns when I first started to crochet, and I just thought it might be helpful to go through the few different ways that you can finish off either a color or just finish off your work. I actually did a tutorial with some other yarn a few days ago, but it was really hard to see the stitches in what I was doing because it was so small. So I'm just going to do it again with something that I'm working on, because I think it's easier to see the stitches in with this yarn. So say you finished your piece, or you need to finish off a color and then start a new color. There's a few different ways that you can tie off or finish off or fasten off your yarn. One way that you'll see sometimes is to make a slip stitch and into the first stitch of your work, or the first stitch of a row. Just make a slip stitch there, and then you pull through your yarn. Of course, the first thing you would do is cut the piece of yarn, and then you could either pull through the yarn, just pull it out, and then you've kind of attached your rows, and then you would weave in this end in such a way that it would, kind of look nice on the piece, and that is one way to do it. If you don't want to, or if you're not doing a slip stitch to the first stitch, then what you would do is, another way to do it is you get to your last stitch, you finish off the stitch, cut the yarn again, and then what I like to do a lot of times is take the cut end and stick it back through the loop from the last stitch that I just made, and then I pull it through and secure that into the last stitch you made, and then you will weave in your end as best you can. It's a little bulkier, but I also feel like it's secure that way, so that's why I like that one. Another option is similar to when you would do a slip stitch into the next stitch. You just, after you've cut your yarn, you just pull it through, and then your last stitch kind of ends up like this with one piece of yarn coming out, and you can weave in your end that way. Finally, one thing you can do is make an invisible stitch, and what that does is it creates a fake stitch between your last stitch and usually the second stitch in your row, and over here becomes, which was your first stitch of the row, would become your invisible stitch, and that just makes the top of your work look a lot better. It depends what you're doing. If you're finishing a piece and you're closing it off, and it doesn't need to look nice, then you can do any of the other ways that we have to finish off or tie off. But if you wanted to make it look nice, then you would do what's called an invisible stitch. For the invisible stitch method, you take the end of the yarn that you've pulled through your last stitch, and you thread it onto a needle, onto a darning needle or a needle that fits with the size of your yarn, and you'll skip this first stitch, which is the first stitch of your row, and into the second stitch of your row, you're going to take your needle and thread it under both loops from the inside of your piece towards the outside. So under both loops of the stitch, where you would normally put in a single crochet, let's say, you would pull the yarn through that from the back to the front, and that's the first step. And then you take the needle and you thread it through the stitch where you ended, your last stitch, but not under both, just under the center. So it's under the back loop, and you pull it through, and then you shape the stitch that you just made, and that makes an invisible stitch. I'm not really sure why it's called that. And don't pull it too tight because that'll mess up how it looks. You want it to be basically as tight as the other stitches around it. And then once you do that, once you pull it through and it looks the way you want it to look, you then can take the part that came out and weave in your end. And just make sure when you're weaving in your end to secure it, you're not pulling this invisible stitch too tight and that it keeps its shape the way you want it. But you do want to have this yarn weaved in well, because you don't want this to pull out, to come out. And that is it. Those are some different ways to fasten off or tie off your work. I hope this was helpful. Feel free to subscribe below. I'm hoping to have a lot more tips and tricks for beginner crocheters out there, and love to hear from you. Thanks.